Hello, my name is Ferdinand Hui, and I want to thank you all for listening to this video. I want to thank the organizing committee for inviting me to give this talk, proposing a stroke system for Hong Kong, as well as for allowing me this unusual format, as I'll explain a little later. I also want to thank the Carey School of Business and Professor Phil Fan for allowing me to record here. I'm actually recording here live from the Carey School of Business. Before I get into any content, here are my disclosures. In 1958, my father came across the Pacific Ocean via the USS Cleveland on this boat. It was the first time he'd ever come to the United States, but he left the land that he grew up for the first 18 years of his life, born in 1940 and remembering bits and pieces of World War II. Hong Kong was a place that he always remembered with such tenderness and affection, and it infected every way he spoke about Hong Kong throughout the time I grew up, listening to the music he grew up with, listening to some of the movies and movie stars that he remembered, learning how he spoke English, which wasn't the British-inflected English. He decided to learn English by copying James Dean and cowboy westerns like John Wayne. And so he spoke a 1950s type of English, and he always shared such love of the place he grew up with. And it's always been a very special place in my heart. My first trip to Hong Kong was in 1979 at the Kai Tak airport. And here's a view of the last day that flights were coming in to the city from the airport. And this is a place that's always been very close to me as well. I've actually traveled to Hong Kong since 1979, pretty much once, twice, up to 3 times a year, up until now, my present age of 43. So you could say that Hong Kong is my second home, and I don't have a picture of it here, but actually I have a Hong Kong ID, 香港身份證, and it's a thing that I just really cherish every time I go to the Hong Kong airport now. HKIA really helps me get through the lines. Needless to say, my connections to Hong Kong are deep. So which gets me to the reason why I can't be there with you today. Here's a PET scan obtained from me about 2 weeks ago, and all of you probably can recognize what this is. It's a nasopharyngeal carcinoma. You can see at the back of my nasopharynx there's a bright photo area of high standard uptake value, really bright, nearly the same intensity as my brain, as well as 2 lymph nodes, one in the retropharyngeal space and one in my level 5. This was a T4 N1 M0 tumor, and I discovered this while giving talks in Malaysia and Kuala Lumpur. It took me 2 weeks to get back to the States, and we went through the diagnosis. Here you can see why it's T4. It's invading my clivus and getting into foramen ovale. I still don't have any cranial nerve palsies, but obviously this is a worrisome thing. And this is another thing that connects me to Hong Kong. This is almost unheard of in North America, but it's very common, as you know, in Hong Kong, Singapore, and Taiwan. And I think this makes me a native son. But this is the reason why I'm not here. I actually debated with my oncologists and my family whether I could delay treatment for a couple weeks to give this talk to you live. But they told me it's probably a bad idea. Maybe not change outcome, but so I'm not there. I'm recording this talk for you, and I hope it expresses how much it means to me to be able to talk about Hong Kong and stroke systems. This last year, I spent 170,000 miles in the air talking about stroke in Taiwan, in mainland China, Singapore, various countries. And to be able to talk about stroke and the delivery of stroke care in Hong Kong means so much to me. Why do I care about stroke? I'm changing the name and I'm changing the clot, but this is a great illustrative case, so I'm going to show it. In 2008, 2009, after finishing my training at Emory University, doing 800 aneurysms between clipping and coiling a year at that institution, we didn't do stroke. We did maybe 1 to 2, maybe 3 cases a year, and they were all bad outcomes. Obviously, it was in the days of the Mercy Retriever. We struggled, patients came late, but we didn't have the greatest results. Coming to the Cleveland Clinic, I was challenged in this. One of my colleagues said, "You need to get good at this." I didn't know whether to believe him. Traveling, I was getting on the road to go on a plane. We traveled from Cleveland out towards the airport, which is a straight shot west. While on that road to catch a plane, I got a call. One of the fellows said, "Everyone's busy. There's a stroke at one of the hospitals, one of the Cleveland Clinic hospitals on the way to the airport." And they said, "No one's available, but there's a stroke, pretty high grade." I asked, "What severity?" Is it 20s? Which vessel? Right MCA. I looked at the clock, maybe had 45 minutes extra, maybe an hour. The Cleveland airport's not the biggest. I decided to stop and stop at the airport. Stop at the hospital on the way to the airport. Pulling into the ER, I walked over and went to the bay where the patient was, and I heard, "Hui-san, hai. It's in Mandarin, but the patient asked, or rather the patient's wife recognized me. Turns out this is the first patient I've ever treated that I knew personally. It was a person I'd done research with, a person that I've worked on devices with, and they were having a severe right MCA stroke. Fortunately, maybe 30 minutes later, we were able to get the clot out after getting the patient in and removing it. And we took out a massive piece of clot, and the patient was able to leave the hospital 2 days after the procedure at NIH Stroke Scale 1. I realized that I had to get good at this, and not only do I need to know how to get good at this, but I needed to figure out how to do this regularly. People were having strokes like this all the time, and we don't merely need good surgeons, but we need good systems. I'll give you one other example. The former chair of plastic surgery at UCLA had a double-dose TPA for a high-grade MCA stroke. He had hemorrhagic conversion, and that ended his career in his mid-40s. This is a disease that affects East Asians at a great rate. China has 2.3 million strokes per year, and it's the number one cause of morbidity and mortality. Hong Kong, it's not the number one cause of mortality, but it's certainly the number one cause of morbidity. And over the next several slides, I hope to really show you the time is now. So the question is, how do we do this? Right now, the clinical trial data, what I'm showing here, what we've all seen these slides, the 2015 studies really show that there is no question anymore. Interventional therapy, surgical therapy of stroke, is better than medical therapy alone. There isn't a single trial that doesn't have statistical significance, and I don't think there's a scientist in stroke now that would argue these results. This slide, however, is one that I think isn't as commonly seen, but this is a slide derived from data from a paper by Meng et al. Looking at workflow analysis. IA recanalization in less than 150 minutes from onset led to a 91% probability of good functional outcome. This good outcome rate decreased by 10% over the next 60 minutes and another 20% each additional 60 minutes after that original 150 minutes. And transfers in this study resulted in delays of approximately 100 minutes. If I were to tell you that a treatment for, say, nasopharyngeal carcinoma resulted in a 91% probability of good outcome, there's no question which treatment we'd get. If I told you a different treatment resulted in, say, a 60 or a 40% good clinical outcome, and I'd ask you which alternative would you take, you would say 91%. This is stroke. If I get the 150-minute version of IA therapy, I get a 91% good probability outcome. If I get the 6 to 7 hour version, I get a 40% or maybe even a 30%. They're vastly different therapies, even though they're the same surgery. And the difference is where we spend our time. So to reiterate on this slide, current generation devices provide effective recanalization. High rates, 70, 80, 90%. Rate limiting step is now time, access to the right care. So what are the principles of designing a stroke system? We want to use societal resources to maximize treatment impact. It's expensive to reorganize systems. And stroke care is a logistic problem. We can treat stroke fast once they're in the hospital most of the time. Getting them to the hospital, to the right hospital, is a problem. There are many hospitals in many cities. Hong Kong is no exception. Not all of them treat stroke fast, and not all of them have stroke units. In the US, we have multiple models for how to get patients to the right hospital. So right now, we are trialing mobile CT, which is really a great extension. By putting a patient on a CT-enabled ambulance, we can evaluate the CT and determine whether or not there's a stroke or a hemorrhage, a ischemic stroke or a hemorrhagic stroke. We can give IV TPA on board, and we can triage the patient in the ambulance and bring them to the right hospital. In early experience we had at the Cleveland Clinic, there were no transfers subsequent to arrival in a stroke ambulance, and that's because we brought them to the right hospital the first time. This saves the transfer times completely, 100 minutes in my Uncle Al's study. Other ways of doing this is telestroke, using physician extenders using telecommunication to use a stroke neurologist to try to triage the stroke. Another approach is ambulances with trained EMS personnel that can use severity scores. Severe strokes need to go to stroke intervention capable hospitals. Minor strokes go to a run-of-the-mill stroke ready hospital. There are various models, and all of them need to be optimized to the environment at hand. Where do we spend time? This is a slide derived from one of the papers I wrote this year about another mode of transport. We transported the doctor to the hospital, and this was a bridge to bring online a stroke center in the DC area. So this stroke process I find really useful to understanding where time goes. If you look at the bar graph on the left, this is the aggregate transfer times and times that we had in the Maryland area for patients being transferred. The area between the two diagonal lines is the steps, the components of a transfer. The area beneath that is actually pre-hospital, which is to say onset, activation of EMS, and arrival to the first hospital. And then the second part is the transfer process. You can see that almost 1/2, maybe 2/5 of this patient's time, brain lost, was due to pre-hospital. They didn't even reach the first hospital. This is how unstreamlined stroke care can be. And then the transfer time took another 2/5 of the patient's ischemic injury until the intervention was initiated. So really, there's a huge amount of logistical time spent in stroke care. Streamlining this saves brain. We can get closer to that 91%, that 150 mark by streamlining these processes. This is a chart of the highest density cities in the world. I was surprised that Hong Kong wasn't number one. However, Macau was. And second, the chart for Hong Kong includes the new territories, which we all know is sparsely populated. Hong Kong, in terms of Tsim Sha Tsui and Central, are absolutely the most densely populated parts of the world. The Hong Kong population map is, as you see on this next slide, and you can see Hong Kong Island and parts of Kowloon are very, very densely populated. And this really instructs how we need to think about designing stroke systems. We need to go where the people are. That's where the biggest impact will be. The rest of Hong Kong probably will operate a little more like the United States, with some degree of ambulance transfers, possibly mobile CT units. But we get the most bang for our buck by building stroke centers, hopefully, in the places where the most people are, where they don't have to move very far to get to the highest level of care. This is a map of Hong Kong's demographics. As we know, stroke becomes increasingly common as we get older. Intracranial atherosclerosis is a major problem in Hong Kong, and embolic disease from cardiac processes is present, but perhaps not as big a component as we see in the United States. Certainly, though, as the population ages, we will see more atrial fibrillation and more of these clots that are generated in the clot and into the brain. And these are going to be clots that need to be taken out by experienced endovascularists. This is coming. We know the population is aging. More and more Hong Kongers are going to be in retirement age. We need to take care of them. What city can we compare Hong Kong to? Hong Kong is not like many cities. I will use one near and dear to my heart, the place where I was born, New York. New York is 1.2 thousand kilometers squared, has roughly 8.5 million people, and is 28,000 square miles. Okay, not as useful for Hong Kongers. It has 6 24/7 stroke centers in Manhattan, 2 in the Bronx, 1 in Brooklyn, and 0 in Queens. So they have some gaps there, but Queens is geographically close to Manhattan. By comparison, very rich Hong Kong, GDP per capita, 58,000 US dollars, putting it just above the US mean in the IMF 2016 report. 7.3 million people. Land mass larger than the New York's, although again, that's including the new territories, which arguably shouldn't be calculated in this particular analysis. About 16.9 square miles, and currently has 0 24/7 interventional capable centers. I don't know how you feel. I know how I feel. And I feel particularly when I have friends that tell me they had a grandma that had a stroke. And I know that we can do it, and they didn't even know there was a treatment. And these are not uneducated Hong Kongers. This is a young lady who does credit derivatives trade for Credit Suisse and has been doing that for 15 years. These are not uneducated people, and they're unaware of the stroke options that exist in Hong Kong. Hong Kong is rich. Hong Kong is educated. Hong Kong has you guys, the most educated, most well-trained interventionalists that money can buy. The question to me is not if Hong Kong should develop a robust stroke system. The question is how. And the time is now, because brains are still dying even as we speak. So what does Hong Kong need? Hong Kong needs sustainable 24/7 access to both IV TPA and IA intervention. We're going to talk about this in greater detail, but workforce needs to be sustainable and the geography needs to be accessible. Here is my rough look at the Hong Kong population map. Here you can see the densest population centers, and this is stratified by how large the population density. So areas of greater than 50,000 per square kilometer are in the lavender, and areas that are a little less dense, say 30 to 50,000 people per square kilometer in orange. And then less density again, 10,000 to 30,000, and 6,000 to 5,000 is this purple, I guess, violet. And so in the new territories, there are still areas with fair amount of population density, but the vast majority are in Hong Kong Island and in Kowloon, the Bayside near Tsim Sha Tsui. To me, these are the places where we need to look for stroke-capable centers, preferably near population mass transport links, near subways. They really raise the possibility of very novel ways of doing things. For instance, in New York, the Mount Sinai system currently is having their doctors take the subway to treat patients at nearby hospitals, and then, after the intervention is done, bringing the patient back to the Sinai mothership to the neurocritical care. I'm not sure that's really feasible in Hong Kong, but the subway is an interesting place. Just throwing it out there, how hard would it be to create a rail ambulance? Just asking. Maybe one car. That's maybe too out of the box, but one of Hong Kong's best strengths is the MTR. Maybe that becomes a way that we can move patients, maybe with a nurse, and transport them rapidly to a stroke-capable center. Anyway, this map is kind of my stab at where I would think about 3 to 4 stroke centers. We need to apply healthcare monies effectively to reduce disease burdens to society. And when treatment occurs, time should be maximally reduced to maximize treatment impact. It's not sufficient to offer a care. We want to give the best care that gives the best result because we are good stewards of society's resources. So, workforce solutions. One other comment is that stroke at present doesn't pay well. Our materials are expensive, but there aren't really great insurance payment mechanisms that really cover the total cost of treating stroke. This is certainly true in Europe. It's true in North America. It's true in China. I don't know the exact reimbursement policies in Hong Kong, but my guess is it doesn't pay very well. Otherwise, we'd already have multiple 24/7 systems. The NHS in England is currently working on multiple stroke 24/7 units. They're addressing this problem. There aren't incentives to do it. So they're going to pay, or they're in the process of paying people specifically to do stroke. And I think this is one way of approaching this, and perhaps one that Hong Kong can consider as well. And why is it not a good idea to just have every single hospital do IA stroke? It's expensive. It's very expensive. Stroke doesn't pay well. And if we are paying 24/7 technologists, 24/7 nurses, 24/7 physicians staffing the ER, whether they're neurologists or the ER physicians, 24/7 imaging technologists, neurosurgical support, neurocritical care and similar ICU support, as well as the angio. How much does it cost to pay people on call as an interventionalist? And for instance, the materials to stock rooms. It's one thing to stock 4 stroke centers. It's another to stock 10. It's another to stock 20. There's an enormous cost to having 20 fully stocked stroke interventional capable hospitals. Dispersing this amongst many low volume treatment centers is just doesn't make sense for society. And beyond that, there's some data, initial data, that shows that high volume centers beat low volume centers in outcome, as well as time to treatment, as well as length of stay. So there are many arguments on concentrating care to groups, to hospitals that are able to optimize the workflow, as well as to concentrate the resources. It's a better way, I think, for organized health systems for an entire region to do care. So what are my proposals? 1, similar to the NHS, establish several core 24/7 stroke units in geographically impactful sites. 2, recruit willing individuals at these sites to provide stroke coverage and compensate accordingly. And 3, track stroke treatment data rigorously. So back to this slide, these are where I would put them. I'm not a Hong Konger. You know better than I do. This is just this fake Hong Konger's way of trying to first stab at where. Each should service around 2 million Hong Kongers each. That's about the same population that the DC has, the greater DC area. And we have 2 to 3 centers right now that are doing medium volume. Geographically located at convenient locations to population centers, I would suggest putting them near transport hubs. That way that we can get some patients that, hey, say, don't activate the ambulance system, the emergency system, and shuttle them their grandma who's having a stroke via subway. Consider also that helipads are probably, I understand, not a great option in Hong Kong due to the high towers. It's probably a reasonable option in rural Hong Kong, which is, say, New Territories, but probably not useful in Tsim Sha Tsui or Hong Kong Island. Sustainable workforce. I know I'm going through this quickly, but this is, I think you know this part. You need 3 on-call interventionalists. Grow up to 4, 5, or 6. The Cleveland Clinic, we had 6 on-call interventionalists for our system. 3 is probably the minimum you need for sustainability. 4 probably makes it a little bit better. But stroke in the middle of the night can be very taxing. And when you are doing a case in the middle of the night, your patients the next day suffer. So if I'm doing, say, 2 complicated dural fistula treatments the next day and I've been up all night doing 2 strokes, that's neither fair to my patients, nor is it sustainable. So I would argue that you need an on-call system. One other alternative is on-call systems that are truly night float. So you have a on-call system that the person that's taking strokes all night long will have no duties the next day. That's probably what you need once you start reaching the 200 to 300 stroke per year volumes. We need similar types of staffing in the stroke call physicians, so the vascular neurologists. They need to be able to see all the false strokes, the fake strokes, the false alarms that masquerade and activate the stroke network, but aren't strokes. Some places use an ED-led model. I'm not sure that's the right choice for Hong Kong, but ED physicians in some locations are the front line and do all of the NIH stroke scales as well as activating the stroke intervention system. Reimbursement needs to be sustainable as well. Hong Kong is not precisely the cheapest city to live in, and I think that the hospital authority and the reimbursement mechanisms need to account for the fact that people that are doing majority stroke work need to be compensated in a way that make it possible for them to live near the stroke center they're servicing. So if you're living in Hong Kong Island, how can they be paid at a salary that they can't live on the island? When a stroke comes in, they can't travel across the bay. They need to be relatively close to the hospital. So these workforce considerations need to enter either dormitory housing or compensation that allows them to be near the stroke unit. We also need to be able to adjust work burden with other responsibilities. So when the volume is low, one of the things that we did at the Cleveland Clinic was all of our interventionalists had another hat. So when I was not doing as much on stroke or endovascular work, I did radiology work. My neurosurgical colleagues did open neurosurgery. My stroke neurology interventional colleagues, which I don't believe we have very many of in Hong Kong yet, they would round on stroke patients or do neurocritical care work. Data is everything. I think if we take the time to build a stroke system, the Hong Kong Hospital Authority and the people need to know that it's been well invested. Without data, we can't improve the system. Without data, we can't analyze how well we're doing. And I think it's really meaningful when we can show that the time to treatment has dropped. Hong Kong is all about ROI. Return on investment. The investment into the stroke system is the equity invested. We need to show them what they're getting out of it. I think data is also very tricky because it's easy to look at things that are low-hanging fruit that don't really tell us what's going on. That's why I've been trying to push our group as much as possible to track things from time of onset. When you see how much time is spent between time of onset to pre-hospital and pre-hospital to your treatment, you realize how much time, how much brain is wasted. Without holding ourselves as a system accountable for all of that time, we're doing our patients a disservice. Who else is going to advocate for ambulance protocol changes? Who else is going to advocate for changes in terms of transfer, in the behavior of EMS, it will be us. It will be patient advocacy groups, but they will use this type of data. So we should not make itself easy on us and only track from door to needle, door to groin. These are easy to track and make us look good. We should be responsible for, in some way, from onset to treatment. And I think that that is the number that will really push us to improve and improve and improve. When we bring that number down, hopefully around 150, we're going to see very good outcomes in these patients. The time is now for Hong Kong. The question is how. I'm not going to have all the right answers. Hong Kongers, ultimately, the solutions are local. You know the local environment better than I do. This is your fake Hong Kongers' attempt at a first-line solution. The action plan to me is establish core stroke units in geographically impactful sites, find the right people that are motivated and believe in this to staff those sites. Personnel can sabotage these sites. You need people that are driven and believe in this. And we need to track data, and we need to hold ourselves accountable for what we're doing because it's expensive. Stroke patients will come. We don't see a lot right now in Hong Kong, but I don't believe we have the infrastructure yet. Here's what we see in the United States. You can see in this paper in circulation that since the trials have come up, there's been a sharp uptick in the number of strokes being treated. As we establish more centers, more and more patients show up. Before I arrived at Hopkins, in the year 2014, we only treated 60 patients in the entire state of Maryland with IA treatments. We are now around 200 for the state. I helped establish a stroke treatment center in Montgomery County. We're on track to do about 25 to 30 this year from zero. The patients will come because the need is there. Hong Kong needs you. Let's find a solution. Thank you.